Imperfect cinema is a Cuban movement in film, usually referred to as third cinema, with first cinema being Hollywood and second cinema being European art. Imperfect cinema was founded by Julio Garcia Espinosa from an essay he wrote in 1969 titled For an Imperfect Cinema. It is a manifesto for what imperfect cinema should be. It does not conform to typical Hollywood conventions nor critical appreciation. It instead focuses on narrative based on the social, cultural, and ethical experiences of the audience. Whilst this is the foundation of what imperfect cinema is, Espinosa also states that imperfect cinema is no longer interested in quality or technique, meaning that a filmmaker shouldn't rely on visuals to tell a story, such like Wes Anderson, James Cameron, or literally any film with an abundance of computer-generated imagery. Imperfect cinema does not look for quality in an artist's work, with Espinosa asking, what are you doing in order to overcome the barrier of the cultured elite audience, which up until now has conditioned the form of your work? What are you doing to separate yourself from the commercialization of Hollywood filmmaking? Espinosa's rule into quality and technique could be seen as a hidden message for embracing amateurism. This is what I'll be acknowledging in my vision of an imperfect cinema. The modern interpretation of an amateur is someone who lacked experience and competence, aka not a professional. But when we look into the origins of amateur, it comes from the Latin word amator, meaning to love. An amateur is someone who loves what they do in spite of their knowledge and expertise. They do it for the passion of the art and not the profit. Espinosa asks the question, why do you feel the need to have critics justify you? The amateur does not seek public acknowledgement. They make the films that they want to make, whether it is appraised or not. Their aim is not for profit or critical reception, but for the love of the art, regardless of their technical imperfections. Espinosa claims that a true artist is prepared to run any risk as long as he is certain that his work will not cease to be an artistic expression. In his follow-up essay in 1994, Espinosa writes about technical imperfection, that being not as an exaltation of misery, but the sense of a stimulus to make movies with the available means, in opposition to Hollywood's aesthetic dictatorship. So whilst Espinosa's point of not relying on technical quality and perfection is not the sole meaning of imperfect cinema, it is certainly an overlooked one, an important one in my opinion. Good quality visuals does not solely make a good film. Film should come from the heart of the filmmaker. Looking back at the weekly tasks during this module, I found that every film I made or was a crew member on had an element of amateurism in imperfect cinema. The first task, for which I was a crew member on, observed some of the political and social problems in England at this time. The film was about a homeless man and a passerby, being a sort of character case study for how people see homeless people, much like how Memories of Underdevelopment, directed by Tomas Guterres Alia, is a character study of social changes and views during the Cuban Revolution. The film is an example of how third cinema can be associated with any part of the world. Whilst it is a Cuban movement, its motivation can be attributed anywhere. As Espinosa says, it is necessary to clarify the fact that this disquiet is not solely motivated by ethical concerns. The motivation is for the most part aesthetic. This means that Espinosa's essay does not just concern itself with Latin cinema, but gets other film movements to question their ethics. The second task was to make a derive film, like The Black Tower, Girl Chewing Gum, and A Portrait of Gar. Guy Debord describes the derive as a technique of rapid passage through varied ambiences. This saw me wandering the streets of Plymouth with no prior planning. As Debord goes on to say, in a derive, one or more persons during a certain period drop their relations, work, and other motives, and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. My discovery during my derive was how much turmoil and rebellion there is in Plymouth. Just like Debord has examined, cities have psychogeographical contours, with constant currents, fixed points, and vortexes that strongly discourage entry into or exit from certain zones, making this a political and social questioning imperfect film, lacking technical prowess but addressing issues in society. The third task of embracing punk cinema saw me as a crew member on a project which in my opinion embraces amateurism, the pure fun of making a movie, not worrying about audience pleasing or careful planning. It's going out on a whim and just making something fun and exciting for you and everyone involved. Whilst this doesn't seem like a punk film, it's important to note that punk films don't necessarily need punk aspects. Professor Stacey Thompson says, punk cinema need not concern itself with punk per se. To grant punk cinema greater efficacy as a descriptor, it is necessary to articulate further the aesthetic to which the term refers. A critical alternative to Hollywood's dominant aesthetics. This means films that resist Hollywood's conventions and economic model, such as Rude Boy and Fight Club. The film for this task is a good representation of my opinion on amateurism and resistance of Hollywood conventions in imperfect cinema. The fourth task had me focus on the psychedelic and experimental. My film's aim was to get the audience to question what they are looking at and what is important without being told the answer, taking inspiration from Paul Sheritas's Nothing and Touching, using flicker and colour change to alter the viewer's mind as the film progresses. The aim of the psychedelic film is not to visually show the effects of psychedelic drugs, but instead to dig deep into the subconscious mind of the viewer, making them come up with their own interpretation of what they are seeing. As John Geiger says, if the eye is stimulated by flickering light, the visual field becomes filled with a wide variety of hallucinatory patterns and formed scenes. So for me to embrace amateurism in imperfect cinema, I created my own manifesto, a set of rules and codes to follow to not let you fall into a trap of perfection and seeking Hollywood conventions. These are: enjoy and have fun when making your film. Embrace yours and the actors' mistakes. You may even want to include them in your film. Allow the actors to improvise. They need to have an enjoyable experience as well as you do. Do not use special effects. Special effects are a gimmick of first world cinema. Don't be afraid to embrace the fourth wall. Do not spend a lot of money on the film. Use what you have around you. Only buy props if you are going to use them to tell the story. Embrace your amateurism. You are an independent filmmaker. Be experimental. Don't be afraid to experiment with your shots. Get creative. So in order to utilize these rules in my open film project titled The Aperture Brothers, I decided to make a mockumentary comedy, taking inspiration from mockumentaries such as This Is Spinal Tap, Borat, and The Office. But first, what is mockumentary? Roscoe defines mockumentary as a genre of filmmaking that makes a partial or concerted effort to appropriate documentary codes and conventions in order to represent a fictional subject. The origins of the mockumentary can be traced back to 1957 when the BBC programme Panorama released a report on the spaghetti tree as an April Fool's joke. The mockumentary was popularised in the 1980s with the release of Rob Reiner's This Is Spinal Tap, with Reiner himself using the term. The film laid the foundation for what mockumentaries would become. I believe that a mockumentary was a good way of showcasing the rules set out in my manifesto of embracing amateurism. The film is not always aesthetically composed. It relies on swift movements of the camera to capture the performances of the actors' improvised dialogue. I wrote the script in a plain, neutral way, giving prompts for the actors, telling them when to improvise scenes whilst also keeping the flow and story of the film. I believe that I have met all of the conditions that I set out in my manifesto. The film was fun for everyone involved. The film ended up being 80% improvised. The props used were there to aid the story, and the film was experimental for me personally, as I have never made a comedy or a mockumentary before. It was good to push myself out of my comfort zone and explore a completely different style of filmmaking as an amateur. If I were to go back and make the film again, I would give myself more time for shooting. This would have allowed me to come up with more scenarios for the actors to improvise and give me more footage to work with in the edit. Also, I would give more consideration for audio. But to look back at my manifesto, Rule 2 was embracing your mistakes, which means that I fully accept all the imperfections, which makes this film a part of imperfect cinema.